Hi everyone. So we are well into Act 3 now, and we're getting to the end of the play. And what we're going to be thinking about today is the generation gap. So your title for today is Act 3, the older versus the younger generation. But if you want to shorten that for yourselves and just call it the generation gap, then that's also fine. That's what we're going to be focused on for today's lesson. We're going to look at some other stuff as well, though. So our learning question for today is, can I recognise, explain and analyse the difference between the changes in the older and younger generations? And the second thing, we're going to look at a theory of time that J B Priestley was quite fascinated with when he was writing. And it's, can I understand Dunne's theories of time and how J B Priestley uses them to highlight the differences between the generations? So I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But before we get on to Dunne and before we get on to the generations, let's do a quick recap of the 7 deadly sins that I was talking about in previous lessons. So I've got the 7 sins all listed down there for you. And the first sin is wrath. And wrath means extreme anger and possibly vengeance as well, or gaining revenge on someone. And at the moment, I've tentatively penciled in Inspector Ghoul for wrath. So extreme anger and the desire for vengeance. You have to think about whether you agree with that or not, or indeed if the inspector should be showing any sins. Mr. B, Mr. Burling, you know, we've got him marked down for greed. His capitalist, individualist outlook on life makes him seem really greedy. Sheila is a nice, straightforward one. The envy, it was her envy of how pretty Daisy Renton, Eva Smith was, that caused Sheila to get her fired from her job and kind of threw her into the loving arms of Gerald. And then Eric is, of course, lust. He saw a pretty girl that he wanted to do whatever he wanted to do with at the end of a drunken night out, and he just used her like an animal, as the inspector said. I'm going to get you to think about sloth in a minute. If you remember, I suggested that Gerald, rather than lust, was gluttony. Gluttony is when you have appetites way beyond what you actually need. So it's normally associated with food, and that's what makes it different from greed. But obviously, Gerald had this kind of gluttony because he had a glut of women, didn't he? He had Sheila on the go, who he was meant to be seeing, but then he was keeping Daisy Renton as his mistress. And then probably the most outrageous of all of the characters when it comes to linking them to the 7 deadly sins is Mrs. Burling, who is arrogant and proud, and not proud in that positive way, but proud as in she walks around with her nose up in the air looking down on people all the time because she thinks she's so much better than all of them. So that's Mrs. Burling. So what about this sloth? It's the one of the 7 deadly sins that has been missed out. So from a little Catholic religious book, this is how sloth is kind of outlined. Sloth is the desire for ease, even at the expense of doing the known will of God. Whatever we do in life requires effort. Everything we do to be everything we do is to be a means of salvation. So basically the way that we act is going to mean that our soul will go to heaven rather than going to purgatory like Scrooge or going to hell. The slothful person is unwilling to do what God wants because of the effort it takes to do it. Sloth becomes a sin when it slows down and even brings to a halt the energy we must expend in using the means to salvation. So who is slothful? It's this kind of laziness when it comes to just day-to-day hard work. But more than that is laziness when it comes to like your spiritual life and doing what God says is right. And I actually think it's all of the Burlings and Gerald, they're all too lazy, it seems, to get out of this pink light at the beginning of the play and to actually take a look at what's going on around them. Everything that they do, apart from Eric defrauding Mr. Burling's customers, it's legal, so it's legally okay, but morally very, very shaky, using prejudice to decide who gets the charity money, refusing workers who are already struggling a little pay rise, keeping a woman as your mistress because that's convenient, using a woman for sexual favors for money at the end of a night because that's what you want, even when she says no, having someone fired because you think they're pretty and they can take care of themselves. So all of these actions, they're not illegal, but they are immoral. Is it slothful, wishing for an easy life, a life where you can just do all those things and think that morally that's okay because you're not breaking any laws? Is doing those things going to help get you to heaven if you have religious Christian beliefs? Probably not just Christianity, actually, probably a lot of other belief systems as well would say that you have to act morally, that your God would want you to act morally. So actually, I would argue that apart from Inspector Gould, all of the Burlings show that spiritual weakness, that laziness, that lack of effort when it comes to making a good moral choice. The difference is Eric and Sheila, certainly by the end of this scene, probably already have decided not to indulge anymore in that slothful behaviour. They are going to make the effort to do the right thing, even if it's not the easy choice. It's much easier to go along with what your parents say than it is to stand up to your parents. It's much easier to look out just for yourself than it is to try and think about the impact of what you do on everybody else. So remember that last deadly sin, the sin of sloth, that can be a spiritual sloth. And actually, at one stage or another, all of the Burlings and Gerald have been guilty of that. But Sheila and Eric are trying to change out of it now. Okay, so I promised you Dunne's theories of time. So if you haven't already, pause the video, go and get something to write with, make sure you're making your notes, catch up on your notes from the previous slide as well, and let's have a think about John William Dunne. Here we go. You can read what it says. I'll just talk through it and explain it a bit more. John William Dunne was a soldier. He was an aviation engineer, so he worked on planes, and a philosopher. So that was at the turn of the previous century. So he was born in the 19th century and then was an adult in the 20th century. So very much at the same time as J B Priestley as he was growing up. He had a weird experience from childhood. He had what are known as precognitive dreams. So that's when you have a dream which acts kind of like a premonition. And because of these dreams, which seem to foretell of the future, he came to this theory that time's not linear. It doesn't run in a straight chronological line. But that's just the way the human mind helps to make sense of time. And his argument, or his kind of what he put forward philosophically, was that past, present, and future all happen simultaneously. And actually, at the time that he was writing, there was lots and lots of interest in psychology and the theory of dreams and so on. So you can imagine that the philosophers, psychologists at the time really grasped his ideas, kind of explored them. And J B Priestley, the playwright of An Inspector Calls, he used some of Dunne's theories in a series of plays known as his time plays, and Inspector Calls is one of those time plays. And the way that it's used in Inspector Calls is this part of his theory. What he imagined was if you could have a sneaky peek into the future, if you could look and see your own future, and you could maybe see the impact of what you've chosen to do now, and you could see how they play out in the future. Would that mean that you change your actions now? Are you going to make different choices now? So that's Dunne's theory of time. That's the one that J B Priestley uses. In the next lesson, we're going to look at another guy's theories of time called Ouspensky. And we've thought a little bit about Ouspensky's theory already. We'll look at him next time. But for now, let's just think about Dunne. And as you read through this next section of Act 3, I want you to think about how Priestley uses this theory of time, that you've had a glimpse into the future. You've seen the consequences of your action. Are you going to change now that you've seen what your actions can do? I want to see how this theory is used to highlight the difference between the younger generation, that is Sheila and Eric, and the older generation, Mr. and Mrs. Burling. We'll leave Gerald out of the equation for now. So that's Dunne's theories of time. If you need to pause and just make some notes there. Okay, so it's watching or reading time, or watching and reading time now. So next section of the play, please. So you're going to go straight to 1 hour, 10 minutes and 30, where Inspector Gould has just done his big speech that we analysed last time, and he's just left. And you'll see this still that you can see on the screen there. That's about 1 hour, 10 minutes, 30. And you're just going to watch about 8 minutes of it, just under 8 minutes. You're going up to the bit where in this version of the play, Eric's going to try and leave the dining room. That doesn't happen in the script. So, as usual, as I always say, make sure that you follow along in your script. We've got some lines that have been skipped over, and 1 or 2 of the lines have been changed a little bit, like for example Eric trying to leave the dining room, which doesn't happen in the script. Those of you who like to challenge yourself, have a go at these 2 tasks. Because remember, it is a drama, and when you're writing and analysing this in your exam, if you can talk about dramatic technique, then you will be getting extra marks for your AO2 and your AO3, because that covers genre and it covers social and historical context, the fact that it is a drama, not a book. So 2 things I want you to look out for. How do the actors, blend Eric and Sheila, using body positioning, proxemics is the drama term for that, proxemics, to distance themselves from the older generation? You look straight at that still and see that's happening already. The way that they're kind of leaning into each other is a really good example. The way that now those 2 are sitting together on one side of the table, and you can see a big spatial difference between where Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling are positioned. It's really making that distance between them really obvious. That's just one example. Look for more examples as you watch. And then your second task, if you're trying to challenge yourself, is how does this actor who plays Mrs. Burling, how does she use facial expression, her vocal tone or tone of voice, and the actual language of J B Priestley's in the script? How does she use those things to convey the deadly sin of pride? How does she show herself to be proud and haughty and arrogant? So pause my video, flip onto this video. As usual, I'll put the link in the description below and in the info above, so you can just click straight onto that, watch the next 8 minutes, and I'll see you back here for some annotation. Okay, so this is where we got to last time. You see there's no annotation here because we did that bit last time, and we're down the bottom, just down here. So the inspector has left. He's given that big ideological socialist style speech telling people they got to look out for one another because your lives are all intertwined. And he's gone, and the Burlings are absolutely distraught, especially Mrs. Burling. Do you remember that one? She's collapsed into a chair. Burling is kind of pacing about, and he has a drink while he's up. And straight away, Mr. Burling's going to turn the blame onto someone, and Eric is in his eye line. And let's have a look at how he goes about it. You're the one I blame for this. So straight away, it's that second person he's using, direct address to Eric. You don't realise all you've done. I don't care now, says Eric. You don't seem to care about anything. No, Eric doesn't care about Mr. Burling getting a knighthood. Eric doesn't care about the scandal. He is quite happy to admit what he's done. He's clearly been worrying about it since the beginning of the play. And he doesn't care who knows what he's done. He's ashamed. Now he's confessed. Now he's got it off his chest. He doesn't care who knows. Mr. Burling is blaming Eric as well because he's the one who's committed an actual crime. Now, if you remember as well, the inspector warned several times. He was like, no, we don't need to get into that now. Plenty of time for recriminations, and you can sort out your family relationships later. And of course, Mr. Burling tries to do this immediately by putting all the blame onto Eric. So straight away, you see that Mr. Burling hasn't really learned, because the inspector says, you know, if we've got nothing else to share, we can share our guilt. And that's what Sheila has got from the start. She wanted to share her guilt. First of all, she wanted to listen to Gerald confess so he could share guilt with Gerald. She could share her guilt with Gerald, and then the others, she needed to listen to their stories so she didn't feel like it was all her fault. But Mr. Burling just wants to dump all the blame on Eric. He's not willing to share the responsibility. So if you notice as well, there's lots of first person Burling. I blame, I care, I was certain for a knighthood in the next honours. So from accusing Eric using the pronouns you, he's putting it back onto himself, because all he cares about is himself. As soon as the inspector's out of that door, he's back into this every man for himself mode again. And you can see that through the repeated use of the first person I just here. And what Eric's thinking is this knighthood that he laughs hysterically at. Do you remember Sheila earlier laughed hysterically as well? Sheila was hysterical earlier when she found out about Gerald's affair, and now now Eric is laughing hysterically because he cannot believe his father's attitude. That Eric can't believe that Mr. Burling thinks that his knighthood is more important than the life of a girl and his unborn grandchild. Eric just can't even fathom that, and that's why he's laughing hysterically, not because he finds it funny, because it's kind of like this thing, if you don't laugh, you're going to cry. He points at his dad, and that's very accusatory. He's accusing him, and you can see why. What sane person would think that getting a knighthood is more important than a dead pregnant girl? Okay, so you see I've used this little clock symbol here, and this is going to be either Ouspensky's theory, which we haven't talked about yet, or Dunne's theory of time. What I've really tried to pull it into is like the idea that if you could look into the future, would you change? And so here's old Burling just here. Eric's laughing, like it's kind of twisted laughter that he's done. For God's sake, what does it matter now whether they give you a knighthood or not? And Burling replies, it doesn't matter to you. Nothing matters to you. It may interest you to know that every penny of that money you stole is repaid. You'll work for nothing. None of this drinking around the town, picking up women in the palace bar. So Mrs. Burling goes on to say, I'm absolutely ashamed of you. And Eric says, I don't blame you, but don't forget I'm ashamed of you as well. So Eric's saying, good, I'm glad that you're ashamed of me. But we're thinking he's ashamed of them, but they feel no shame on themselves. They've seen the outcome of their actions using Dunne's theories, but they've made no attempt to change what they believe. So you can see here, Eric, I don't blame you. He's accepting of the blame. Underneath, Mr. Burling says there's every excuse for what both your mother and I did. It turned out, unfortunately, that's all. Mr. Burling is accepting no blame at all for what's happening. He's not accepting the blame on behalf of his wife. And then if we jump right down to the next little yellow bit, Sheila, the younger generation, remember, she says, I behaved badly too. I know I did. I'm ashamed of it. And she's accepting the blame. But she's also pointing out at the same time, you're beginning all over again to pretend that nothing much has happened. She says that to her father. So again, she recognises that the older generation, mum and dad, mother and father, are not accepting the blame. They're pretending nothing happened. So if we think we've got this time theory again, you've seen the future, you've seen what happens to this girl as a result of your actions, but you're kind of pretending that none of it happened. You're pretending that nothing you did made an impact on her life, but we've seen that it did. This is what Sheila is saying. She's saying, I recognise it, I take the blame, but you need to accept blame too, but they're just not accepting it. Now, talking about time, we've got a loop back here. Sheila's scornful. That's all. She's incredulous. She can't believe that her parents, that her dad is refusing to acknowledge what he did. What have you to say? She said, I don't know where to begin. She's got so many things that she wants to say about why her parents are so wrong that she can think of nowhere to start. So it is, again, this time loop. Burling says, then don't begin. Nobody wants you to. Now, do you remember at the beginning? Eric said to Mr. Burling, Burling says, I want to make a speech. And Eric says, well, don't make one. Nobody wants you to make one. But we've got this role reversal going on. Burling almost echoes Eric's words from Act 1. And Eric was being really childish, a little bit drunk, very immature. But now Burling sounds just like Eric, doesn't he? So we've got this role reversal going on. And it's actually Mr. Burling, I'd argue, who sounds like a child. Silly old Eric, who was a bit squiffy earlier. So this like looping of time, not the same as Dunne, but you'll see it's the same as Ouspensky when we look at that next lesson. Burling says to Sheila, nothing much has happened. You can see what I've annotated there. There's a dead girl who was pregnant with Burling's dead grandchild. And he says nothing much has happened. It's absolutely astonishing, isn't it? He's seen what's happened and now he's saying nothing much has happened. All he cares about is his reputation. I put here in green. There'll be a public scandal unless we're lucky. All he's thinking of is covering this up so there is no scandal. Sheila says, I'm not talking about a scandal. I don't care about that. I've just put here neither Eric nor Sheila. They don't care about the scandal. They'd be quite willing to stand up. Eric could say, I stole money to help a girl that I was seeing who got pregnant and I felt terrible and I had to steal money and embezzle money because I wanted to look after her. But sadly, she found out the money was stolen, didn't want the money anymore. I tried to do the right thing, but I did something criminal in doing the right thing. And he's like, no, I'll put my hands up and I'll face up to that. Sheila wants to change. She desperately wants to change. And she wants to tell her parents to change as well. And they're not learning from what's happened. And that's exactly what Sheila goes on to talk about. You don't seem to have learned anything, Sheila says. And Sheila's talking about morality, responsibility, about like when you do an action, there's going to be a consequence to that action. If you sack a girl, then she might not necessarily find a decent job, or she might find a decent job and then just fall like a domino when someone else horrible gets her fired from that job, and you don't know where it's going to lead. And that's what Sheila wants her parents to understand, and they're not getting it. She says you haven't learned anything, and Burling says, don't I? Well, you're quite wrong there. I've learned plenty tonight. But what he's talking about is Eric's behaviour. He's learned that Eric is a drunkard. He's learned that Eric picks up easy women in bars, and does the nasty with them. He's learned that Eric's stolen money. That's everything that he thinks he's learned. But what he hasn't learned is that his behaviour is immoral, and it's his behaviour that started everything. And this is the difference between the generations. The youngsters have learnt that what they've done is wrong, but the elder generation, they just have learned a load of scandal and gossip about Alderman Meggerty and Eric, and that's what they feel like that they've learned, just kind of gossip and dishing the dirt on each other. Now, Eric does a nice little speech here, and if you remember the end of last lesson, I was summing this point up, the idea about the narrative arc when the inspector comes in, when Mr. Burling is talking about capitalism and individualism, about a man has to look after himself or his family. And then it ends with this kind of socialist belief, we are responsible for each other, which the inspector does, which sums up socialism. And in between the individualism or capitalism at the beginning and the socialism at the end, we have a series of stories or anecdotes, if you like, showing why individualism and capitalism is bad, and showing why socialism and having social responsibility is good. And Eric sums it up just here. Do you remember what you said to Gerald and me after dinner when you were feeling so pleased with yourself? You told us that a man has to make his own way, look after himself and mind his own business. We weren't to take any notice of these cranks who tell us everyone has to look after everyone else, as if we were all mixed up together. Do you remember? Yes. And then one of those cranks walked in, the inspector. I didn't notice you told him it's every man for himself. So during that narrative arc, the inspector is successful in shutting down Mr. Burling, as Eric notices. But again, Eric sums this up really, really neatly. And Eric is kind of onto understanding who the inspector is and what the role of the inspector is within this narrative, and what the inspectors come to do to the Burling family and Gerald. And Sheila and Eric are on a wavelength with this. What's the matter, Sheila? It's queer, very queer. And she looks at them. And Mrs. Burling, I know what you're going to say because I've been wondering it myself. And Sheila says, doesn't matter, but was he a real inspector? And Burling says it does matter, and Sheila says it doesn't matter. And that's because they're coming at this from totally different angles, because the two generations, Sheila wants to change, Mr. Burling, Mrs. Burling, older generation, don't want to change. They're looking to cover things up, whereas they want to bring around social change to youngsters. Sheila says, no, it doesn't make any difference. And Burling, again, he sounds like a child, doesn't he? He sounds like Sheila from earlier. Don't talk rubbish. Of course it does. Well, it doesn't to me, it oughtn't to you either. So Sheila's the one who's being calm and mature. This is kind of ironic because in the next section that we're not looking at in this lesson, you see Mr. and Mrs. Burling up to their old tricks again, calling Eric and Sheila children and trying to get them to go to bed and so on. And here's the irony: don't be childish, Sheila. And it certainly does seem Burling, don't talk rubbish, sounds very childish. And Sheila, who's been calm and mature, is accused of being childish by Sheila. So you've got that irony going on there. Eric is a bit childish. Mr. Burling says, any more of your talk, Sheila, and you'll leave this room. And Sheila, Eric replies, that'll be terrible for her, won't it? He's like really, really sarcastic. And Sheila's like, I'm going anyway in a minute or two. Sheila has had enough of the older generation. She's like, I don't even want to be in the same room with you now. I'm like, she wants to put that distance between them. Remember how at the beginning she was just like her mum? She called Eva Smith impertinent, and she was going, oh, look, mummy, at her ring. Isn't it a beauty? She was just like her mum, and she just wanted to please her mother. And now she just wants to distance herself from that older generation, even her dad. So, Sheila doesn't care whether he's a police inspector or not. Neither does Eric. He was our police inspector. He's our inspector, all right, says Eric. And can you see how Sheila is really agreeing with what Eric says? That's what I mean, Eric. if it's any comfort to you, it wasn't for me. I have an idea that there was something curious about him. He didn't seem like an ordinary police inspector. And Sheila doesn't care that Ghoul is fake. It doesn't comfort her at all. And she knows, she's saying that to Eric. She hopes to comfort him, but she knows he won't be comforted either, because they both did what they did and they both carry in that guilt. But it makes such a difference to the elder generation, the older generation. So going a little bit further down, it's quite fun what Mrs. Burling and Burling say here. His manner was quite extraordinary, so rude and assertive. And then Burling says, the way he talked to me, telling me to shut up. And I just wanted to remind you, I've been saying all the time, if we accept that the inspector is kind of like a symbol for the conscience that none of the Burlings had at the beginning, he always echoes the style of the person he's talking to. So this is quite fun, isn't it? Mrs. Burling describes his speech style, which just echoes her own speech style, remember, as rude and assertive, because that's exactly what she's like. All she's doing is hearing her own voice back through him. And Burling here telling me to shut up. Well, look what Burling said, like 10 lines up or something, don't talk rubbish. He spends half the beginning of the play telling Eric to shut up. He's always cutting into people and not letting them finish their sentence. So you can see why the inspector's always telling Burling to shut up, because that's exactly what Burling does to everybody else. The only way that you get a word in edgeways against Burling is to tell him to shut up, because he's always shutting up everybody else. So really kind of like dramatic irony if the audience been particularly sharp in that bit. And look, he's back to this old attitude from back in Act 1 again, isn't he? I was an ex-Lord Mayor and a magistrate and so forth. It's all coming back again. All the arrogance, all the trying to pull rank, like, do you know who I am? You can almost say it. Did he know who I was? He must have known, but he'd still acted strangely. And again, we see Sheila and Eric agreeing with each other and backing each other up like they did up here. It doesn't make any real difference, says Sheila. Mrs. Bowen says it does. Eric says, no, Sheila's right, it doesn't. So do you remember at the beginning, all these two seem to be able to do was bicker childishly, but now they're agreeing and they're bonded together. Remember that challenge task. How are you going to act that if you're the actors on the stage? How are you going to show that closeness in attitude on the stage? Burling again is really angry and directs it all towards Eric. We might look a bit ashamed of ourselves in public. As for you, he can ruin you, And Eric's not even bothering to answer anymore, because he knows there's absolutely no point in arguing against his dad. He's made his point. He said what he thinks is important. The crime isn't important. It's the way that we treated the girl that is important. And Eric knows there's no point in saying any more to his dad. So he doesn't care about being ruined, having his reputation ruined. He cares about the way that they treated the girl, because he's seen what's happened as a result of it. It's that Dunne's theory of time there. Now, if we have a look at Sheila and Burling's reactions, so they're both saying, right, the inspector is a fake. Sheila is thinking really slowly. She's asking questions of the others, but really of herself. We hardly ever told him anything he didn't know. She's thinking really deeply. What does the inspector mean? She seems to have twigged that it's something a lot deeper and a lot more kind of metaphysical than her dad seems to think. She's been more lateral. She's wondering, perhaps, is the inspector like their conscience? And it was Eric who kind of gave her that clue when he said about the timing of when the inspector entered. Mr. Burling, on the other hand, has been very literal in the way that he interprets the inspector, and we see more of that as it goes on. He says he had a bit of information and made a few smart guesses. And then further on, he says, when Gerald comes in, he says, we've been hoaxed. So basically, he seems to think that the inspector is some kind of a prankster, some kind of a hoaxer. Maybe he's been paid by someone who's got a grudge against Mr. Burling. So he's been very, very literal. And he's almost suggesting if we can find this man who pretended to be the inspector and we can pay him off, we can hush up all of this scandal. That's the inference that you can make from this section. Okay, now look at Mrs. Burling here. She's all proud and arrogant again, and Sheila is so ashamed of her. Mrs. Burling says, he certainly didn't make me confess, as you call it. I told him quite plainly I thought I'd done no more than my duty. She's been proud and arrogant again. Because she turned down that girl for charity money, that girl has died of suicide and taken Mrs. Burling's grandchild with her, and yet she is proud of herself that he didn't catch her out. And now she's going back to saying, not, I feel sorry for you, Eric, I wouldn't have done it if I'd known. She's saying, I did no more than my duty. She's saying that everything she did was absolutely right, and she's really proud again. She was proud that she didn't get caught out by Eva Smith trying to trick her, and now she's proud again that the inspector didn't trick her. That's all she cares about. Horrible. Sheila is so ashamed of her mother. Oh, mother. J B Priestley hasn't even put a tone of voice in there because I think it's very, very obvious. I think that I'd probably be face planting if I was acting out Sheila now. Definitely lots of shaking my head. So here we've got Burling going, you've been bluffed. You've allowed yourself to be bluffed. Yes, bluffed. And Mrs. Burling is saying, no, I certainly wasn't. No, not you, my dear, those guys. And look, he was prejudiced against us from the start. He didn't like us. And the irony of this, because actually it was that prejudice of Mrs. Burling's, and she even admitted that she was prejudiced against Eva Smith. It was her prejudice, not the inspector's prejudice. And here we go, exactly as Eric predicted. He was probably some kind of socialist or a crank. So someone who has slightly different ideas from what Mr. Burling has. He just writes them off as a little bit crazy in the head, a little bit too political in a direction he doesn't agree with, socialism. Okay, so we've got this motif of time coming back here. Eric says, didn't notice you standing up to him. By that time, you'd admitted you'd been taking money. What chance had I after that? And you're like, but Eric admitted taking money in Act 3. And we've had half of Act 1, the whole of Act 2, and at least a third of Act 3. The inspector had been there for a long time when Burling didn't stand up to him. Burling tried to bluff him and bluster him at the beginning, but he certainly didn't stand up to him at any point. And Mrs. Burling seems to be worse than ever. The way you children talk, and again we get this irony of you children, because it's actually Mr. and Mrs. Burling who are acting like children. You might be wanting to help him instead of us. Well, it's not really about helping the inspector. It's about making yourself better people and learning from what you've done. And again, she's gone back to treating them like children. Just be quiet so your father can decide what we ought to do. So Mrs. Burling seems absolutely worse than ever, but she certainly hasn't changed, and she hasn't learnt to be less selfish, and she hasn't learnt to think about the consequences of her actions. Now, though, there's a ring at the front door, and this doorbell and the telephone bell later become really, really significant. They look at each other in alarm. So Mr. and Mrs. Burling, although he's saying he stood up to the inspector, or would have stood up to the inspector, Mrs. Burling's been proud and arrogant again. They are still nervous, aren't they? They're still really, really edgy. And they're kind of waiting for another inspector to come, because the previous inspector hasn't arrested anyone or issued any warnings or anything. So they're still very nervous. So who's going to get the bell? No, Edna will go, says Mrs. Burling. I asked her to wait up to make us some tea. And this is just a little, we're going to have a little cameo from Edna here. But again, in the context of the play and what we've been talking about, it really, really highlights and exemplifies Mrs. Burling's superior, entitled attitude, selfishly expecting Edna to wait up late into the night just in case these guys fancy a cup of tea before they go to bed. You're telling me that Mrs. Burling couldn't make a pot of tea if Edna had left the tray out for her, if she couldn't just have poured some hot water onto some tea leaves. So really, really selfish treatment of the working classes. And again, you might have thought if Mrs. Burling had learned anything, that she might think, no, I'll be more kind and considerate. I'll let Edna go to bed. She's just got these working class people fetching and carrying for her. So Gerald comes back in. He says he's got a special reason for coming. And Sheila says the inspector only went a few minutes ago. He put us all through it. Mrs. Burling is warning Sheila. She is terrified that Gerald will find out Eric has committed an actual crime, and she doesn't want Gerald to know. And Burling agrees with Mrs. Burling again. So we've got this older generation always in tune with each other. No, we needn't bother him with all that stuff. So neither of them want Gerald to know about Eric's behaviour, particularly his criminal behaviour. How did he behave? And he was frightening, said Sheila. Burling says he acted peculiar, suspicious. Mrs. Burling calls him rude, extraordinary. So remember that Mrs. Burling's the real rude one around here. And I thought, just for your really short little quotations that you might want to collect, these are some handy ones in case you know that you might want to answer an essay about the inspector. Now, what we have coming up here is what's known as the denouement. So we're starting in the story, or so it seems, to tie up all the loose ends. So all the little bits and pieces and problems and dilemmas that we've had in the play, they're going to start getting tied up together, or are they? So Gerald declares that man wasn't a police officer. What? Are you certain? I'm almost certain that's what I've come back to tell you. And Gerald says, I met a police sergeant I know down the road. And similar to that Edna point, in a way, it just shows that Gerald, rather like the way that Mrs. Burling has poor old Edna staying up all night to be at her beck and call, it seems that Gerald has some members of the police like in his pocket. Why would Gerald know a police sergeant? Well, being Gerald, it'd probably be very handy to have good connections with the police, wouldn't it, if he needs anything covered up. So someone like Gerald, this man about the town, would have these connections. So Mr. Burling is even kind of insulting Gerald. You didn't tell him, like, about no, he's so worried about scandal and his reputation still. And this is one of my favourite lines from the play, and you can't do any analysis on it, but it just makes me laugh. By jingo, says Mr. Burling, a fake. I like By Jingo because it's very Edwardian, and the way that he's so pleased that this is all, as he thinks, a practical joke, just makes me giggle, that line. Mrs. Burling says triumphantly, it's as if she's won a prize or something. Didn't I tell you? Didn't I say I couldn't imagine a real police inspector talking like that to us? No, she didn't tell us. It was Sheila who told us, wasn't it? Now it's Gerald. So Mrs. Burling, in her triumphant mood, is even claiming credit for something that she didn't do. So this is her pride and her arrogance again coming into the mix. Now, do you notice on this whole kind of long page here, and a bit previous to it and a little bit following it. Do you notice who's not speaking in this section? Well, it's Eric and Sheila. And sometimes in a drama, it's really interesting to focus on who's not saying anything. If any of you are students in drama, this is quite difficult if you're on stage and you haven't got anything to say, because what do you do with yourself if you're not speaking? If you have a long chunk of the play where you're not involved in the action, well, obviously you have to stay in character. What are you going to do? So how should the actors playing Eric and Sheila behave? When these guys are all kind of celebrating and acting triumphant and acting excitedly, and Gerald's all really pleased with himself because he's found this out, what will Eric and Sheila be doing? Perhaps holding hands, perhaps edging away from Mr. and Mrs. Burling and Gerald, perhaps looking at each other with kind of shocked stares. So think about how those two actors would be acting whilst they have no lines to say. How are they reacting to what they hear happening? It's really important because they're still on stage, still visible to everybody in the theatre. So Burling phones up his great mate, Colonel Roberts, the chief constable, and he finds out that Ghoul is a fake. So he is a fake. And Mrs. Burling is just so happy. Sheila is bitter. She speaks bitterly. I suppose we're all nice people now. This is absolutely dripping with sarcasm and it's highly ironic. I've just put my annotation here. If no one knows about their bad behaviour, then it's as if their horrible behaviour never happened. So as long as it doesn't get into the public domain, then it didn't happen. That's what Sheila's saying. And she knows that it happened. And that's what she's struggling with, that guilt of knowing it. And again, Eric agrees with her. She's right, though. And Burling, look, do you remember what I said about him telling people to shut up? If you've got nothing more sensible than that to say, Sheila, you better keep quiet, because that's all Burling does, just tells people to shut up if he doesn't agree with their point of view. And that's why the inspector kept telling him to shut up, because the inspector did not agree with his point of view. So Burling says, you better keep quiet anyway. If that police inspector had heard you confess. And again, Burling's about to give away what Eric has done. Eric tells Gerald in a bit anyway, he doesn't care. That Gerald knows. Sheila says, you see, Gerald, you happen to know the rest of our crimes and idiocies. And I put, is this hypocrisy again, isn't it? The hypocrisy of the upper middle classes and the upper classes. As long as none of the working classes know the way that we're behaving, then we don't behave like that. So if you haven't seen it, if you haven't got evidence, we didn't do it. So here we've got Burling. Of course, somebody put that fellow up to coming here and hoaxing us. And Mr. Burling really believes it's just a prank. That's what he thinks it is. And then he goes on to say, there are people in this town who dislike me enough to do that. And it does make you wonder. Obviously, he sacked Eva Smith early on in the narrative when you put it back together in a linear order. What else has he done to make people want to play such a horrible prank on him if he's right and it is a prank? It does make you wonder what other immoral and upsetting things he's done to other people to upset other people. So all Mrs. Burling wants is a little bit of time to sit quietly and sensibly and decide if there's anything to be done about it. As I suggested earlier, the inference there is, let's track down this man who's impersonating a police inspector, maybe pay him off so we can cover up this scandal. And Burling, so do you remember what I said about the generations being bonded together against each other? Burling's agreeing with hearty approval. You're absolutely right, my dear. So while Sheila is agreeing with Eric and Eric's agreeing with Sheila, that's the younger generation, Mr. and Mrs. Burling keep agreeing with each other as well, representing the older generation. Burling suggests to Eric, you should sit down, but Eric remains standing, and that probably keeps him united with Sheila. They're probably standing together, standing united, both of them taking the moral high ground, and that's why they want to stay in this high position. Remember, if you're high, it gives you more power. So although Eric's acting sulkily, he wants to have that status that standing up gives him. And this little section I'm going to finish here is slightly different from the play. Just remember your own position, young man. If anyone's up to the neck in this business, you are, so you better take some interest in it. And Eric, remember how upset he was earlier. I take too much. That's my trouble. And I've just annotated it. Eric is devastated over Eva's death. All Mr. Burling is interested in is how he can cover it up. So that's the end of our annotations for this section. What I'm going to do next is run through the learning objective. I've made some notes which kind of turned into an essay. So I'm going to post a copy of the note/essay in the description down below, so you can click on those and print yourself off a copy if you like. If you've been annotating away, this might be a really good chance to pause and just take a break before we come back and have a look at the learning questions, learning objectives, to see if we have achieved those. Okay, so our learning question, let's go up a bit. There we go, it's better. Can I recognise, explain and analyse the difference between the changes in the older and the younger generations? And the second part was, can I understand Dunne's theories of time and how J B Priestley uses them to highlight the differences between the generations? So here we go. I've started off in blue, focusing mainly on Mr. and Mrs. Burling. Mr. and Mrs. Burling, who represent the older generation, blame everything that happened on Eric. They're only interested in covering up his crime and recovering the money he stole by defrauding Mr. Burling's clients. The older generation have become more like children in their attitudes and language. They quickly decide that Gould is some kind of prankster with a grudge against Mr. Burling, who has perpetrated this hoax. They're excited to learn from Gerald that Gould isn't a real policeman and think this changes everything. They think they've learned a lot during the course of the evening, but what they have learned centres around what Eric gets up to, which they plan to stop. They've learnt nothing about the way their actions impact on others. From having collapsed when the inspector first left, Mrs. Burling is back to her proud and arrogant ways, acting triumphantly and defending all her actions regarding Eva Smith. The older generation agree with and defend each other throughout this section of the play. You're absolutely right, my dear. Mr. and Mrs. Burling had a glimpse into the future through Priestley's use of Dunne's theory of time, but choose to revert to their old ways. They have not changed at all. In fact, believing they've got away with their morally dubious behaviour, it could be said that their faults are worse than ever. Okay, so second section about Eric and Sheila. Eric and Sheila, who represent the younger generation, are eager to admit how guilty they feel about their behaviour towards and treatment of Eva Smith. They have learnt that the way they behave impacts other people, not just Eva Smith. They urge their recalcitrant parents to share the responsibility, guilt and shame, but the older generation are now convinced they did nothing wrong, despite at this time believing Eva Smith and her unborn child to be dead. Sheila's quick to realise that Gould is not a real policeman, but rather than writing him off as a hoaxer, she thinks deeply about his purpose. Eric links his arrival to Burling's every man for himself speech, trumpeting individualism, and recognises Gould as a socialist crank who wishes to challenge the Burling's beliefs. The younger generation behave more calmly and thoughtfully than their overexcited parents. Unlike his parents, Eric is unconcerned who knows about the crime he has committed and is much more concerned about the amoral behaviour of all the Burlings and Gerald, which led to Eva Smith's death. Eric and Sheila were distraught before the inspector's exit and remain so now. Indeed, perhaps more so, as now they're forced to take on their parents' guilt as well as their own. Like their parents, school has given them a glimpse into the future, and they can clearly see the effect of their actions. Both are determined to change their ways in stark contrast to the older generation. Priestley demonstrates that in the UK of 1945, young people should take charge of social change for the better for all people from all stations in life, as the older generation are too stubborn and pig-headed to see the errors of their ways and make the changes society needs. Okay, so that was meant to be a summary, but it kind of turned into an essay. There are a couple of words which I just wanted to explain to you. So a couple of bits of vocab. Recalcitrant means stubborn and not listening to reason or not listening to authority. So hopefully you can see that word really, really suits the Burlings. Sheila and Eric are trying to be mature and trying to explain something to them. The inspector, who is in a position of authority, was trying to explain something to them and trying to get them to learn something, but because they were so recalcitrant, they were stubborn and unyielding and unwilling to change their opinions or to respect the authority that any of those people had, and they certainly wouldn't respect the younger generation. The other word that I used down here was amoral behaviour. And amoral means when it's morally dubious. So really what I said on the previous page. So when you look at something, you're like, that's not right. So it's not against the law, but it's very kind of like clearly not the right thing to do, but it's just being kind of shrugged off, amoral behaviour. And then the last one I used was another word for stubborn, actually pig-headed. So another word for stubborn, and although it is kind of slightly slang, it's like quite posh slang, so you could use that in an essay as I've done here. Okay, so really for this lesson what I mainly wanted you to do was to watch the video, to read really, really closely, to understand that theory of time and to make some good notes. However, if you want to challenge yourself a little bit, have a read through my essay. I did polish it up a little bit before I posted it, not a lot, just a few words here and there. So when I put these notes together, they were just meant to be a summary to try and address the learning question, but it turned into an essay. What you could do to challenge yourself is have a real think about what the strengths and weaknesses of this essay are, thinking about the AQA mark scheme. So these are the 3 assessment objectives. So critical style, yeah, decent actually. Informed personal response, decent. Textual references, maybe not enough, but some. Quotations, yeah, maybe not enough, some. I definitely had some interpretations going on there. So strong AO1. AO2, analysis of language, form and structure. Have a think about that. Do you think I do it enough? Enough for 40% of the marks? Have a think. How it's used to create meaning. Do I talk about the genre? Do I talk about the audience? Am I talking about the way the play is structured in that little section? Did I zoom in on any of the language? Remember, it's not just about zooming in on language. It is about it being a drama, and it is about the way it's structured as well. Did I talk about that? Have a think about it. You might argue yes or no, but have a think about that. And then finally, the AO3, text and the context in which they were written. So have I thought about the context of what is written in that essay, whereabouts? So as I said, AO1 strong. You might want to think about AO2, AO3 when you're having a read through that essay and think, does it do enough to get a good mark for all of the different assessment objectives? Right, next lesson, will be last lesson on In Spectacles, and we'll be watching the rest of the play. We're going to be thinking, as I promised, about Ouspensky's theory of time, and looking very, very closely at the structure of the play, thinking about Ouspensky's theory. We are going to think about who is the inspector. So I'm going to throw at you lots of the different theories that people have come up with about who the inspector is, and you can have a go at ranking those and deciding which one you agree with most. And we will also think about what is the well-made play, so a specific type of play, and we'll be having a quick think about that next time. So until then, enjoy In Spectacles, enjoy your learning, and I'll see you soon. Bye.